Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this GAZ 67B Russian field car. It's kind of like a Jeep, but it isn't a Jeep, it's a GAZ. This model is the Tamiya 1/48th scale kit which I built somewhat recently. You won't be surprised to learn that this little truck was quite easy and enjoyable to put together. If you want to see the build video, there's a link in the description and in the upper right corner now. Okay, let's get to the painting. I start with a primer because that's a sensible thing to do if you want to be sure the paint is going to stay on the model, and I would rather the paint stayed on the model. In this case, I have primed using AK Interactive Black Primer with microfiller. It is a good primer, however, feel free to use any primer you like. I begin adding some colour with Vallejo Model Air Russian Green. I figured with this being a Russian vehicle and all, Russian green would be an appropriate choice. Is it historically accurate? I have no idea. It looks right enough to me though. Like with the primer, feel free to use whichever colour you think looks most appropriate. Unsurprisingly, applying this is simple. Just spray it all over the vehicle in light coats. It is better to do a couple of thin coats and build up the opacity than to dump a single thick coat on it and have it ruin details and look all chunky. If you don't have an airbrush, you can still do the same thing with regular brushes. Just make sure that the paint is nice and thin and don't rush it. I applied some highlighting from above with a mix of roughly 2 parts of the Russian green and 1 part model colour dark sand. I used dark sand here because I just couldn't find my bottle of buff. It worked fine anyway. I mostly spray this from above, and fairly lightly. I do also try to hit the sides just a little bit, particularly the upper parts of the wheels. The idea here is just to lighten the base colour a little to represent both light hitting the model from above and a hint of faded paint colour. I do want this to represent a fairly new and looked after vehicle, so I don't want to go too far with things like faded paint. At this point I realised that I'd completely forgotten about the windshield, so I carefully paint it with Russian green. It's a good part and all, but kind of annoying that the glass and frame are all in one. I would much rather have been able to spray the entire thing, and then install the clear part later. Oh well, this is how it is, so this is what we do. I used a bread bag clip that I'd broken in half to scrape any bits of paint off the clear areas. That's simple enough, you just have to be a bit careful with this so that you don't rub the paint off while handling it. I installed that part in the appropriate location, facing the appropriate way. I do intend to leave this folded down, so I only really painted the side that would be facing upwards. Then it's time to do some dry brushing. For this I'm using a roughly 50-50 mix of Russian green and model colour buff, which I found again. I started at the windshield very lightly applying this. Obviously I don't want it on the clear areas. I felt like it wasn't quite doing enough, so I took a fine brush and used that to apply the highlights around the windshield. It's a bit rough, but I figure that's probably fine. Once I'd done that, I removed the windshield, which is an option I quite enjoyed while painting this, and then, using the same colour mix, dry brushed the rest of the model. It's not as stark a highlight as some might apply. I'm trying to go for a subtle look rather than incredibly obvious edge highlights or something like that. This is partially to bring out some of the raised details and edges, but also to represent areas where there might be some more fading and light damage to the paint. It also helps just break up the solid green colour. It's a very simple technique of course, but I feel like it adds a lot. Once that's all done, I apply a coat of Army Painter Military Shader, mostly because I hadn't used this before, and I wanted to see what it would look like. This was thinned about 2 parts shader to 1 part water. As you can see, I'm more or less just slopping this on all over the vehicle. I am trying to avoid having it pool up too much in any one area, though I do want it to be a bit heavier in gaps and around the raised bits. I also painted this onto the windshield frame, though I was a bit more careful there. I was pretty happy with the result. It's added a bit more colour variation and an overall dirty-ish look. Not bad. I'll probably use this again on future green vehicles. Next, I applied some gloss varnish to areas I was thinking of putting decals on. I did actually consider putting the identifying stripe across the hood, but I ruined one of those decals and gave up. I wasn't super attached to the idea, so I was happy enough to use some of the other markings on the decal sheet. I'm not sure exactly what these markings mean, it's not really important to me, but the marking guide said it was standard, whatever that means. Anyway, I'm satisfied with what I ended up with. It's pretty simple, which is fine. Simple is the Russian way after all, isn't it? Moving on, I added a bit of chipping to the decals using Model Air Russian Green. This is obviously no longer a perfect match for the base coat, but it does work well enough to add a bit of chipping to the decals with. Like I said earlier, I'm not going for a totally beat up vehicle here, so I don't want to do too much to the markings. Just enough so that they don't look like they've been freshly painted. I then applied some sponge chipping. As usual, the mix is imprecise, but around 3 parts Model Colour German Grey, though sometimes I do use black grey, and 1 part Model Colour Mahogany Brown. I'm using a piece of packaging foam which I've roughed up the end of, and I'm applying it almost like a dry brush in that most of the paint is removed, and I'm dabbing it onto the areas I want chips in an up and down motion. It's important to avoid dragging the foam across the model here. If you do that, it won't look like chips, it'll just look like a mess. I do try to focus this in areas where the vehicle will have the most wear, like the edges of the body where people would be climbing in and out quite frequently. I tried not to go too heavily with this, but it is very easy to apply a bit too much, and I think I did that. Oh well, it does look decent enough anyway. I followed that chipping with a couple of finer scratches. I apply these with a fine brush and the same paint mixture as the rest of the chipping. I try to do this very lightly so that it looks like a scratch, and not like I've just painted a line on the side of the model. The seats were painted next, and I did this with AK Interactive Red Brown Leather. I quite like this colour. It's very red and brown and leathery, I guess. I did look at some reference images, believe it or not, and not all of them had seats in a colour like this, but I did see at least one. And that's more than enough justification for me to use this colour. Obviously I'm trying to avoid getting this on the green areas, and it is pretty thin right out of the bottle, so it definitely needs to be done in a couple of coats. I'm pretty happy with this colour. It adds a fair bit of variety to what was until now an entirely green vehicle. Sure, it's got markings and some colour variation, but it's still a bit more visually interesting to have the seats in a much different colour. At least in my opinion. I then used AK Interactive Canvas Tone to paint the canvas rolls on the sides. I figured this would be a reasonable colour because, well, canvas. There isn't really much to painting these, just be careful not to paint the green areas. Then I painted the steering wheel black. This is Vallejo Model Air black. I did see some examples of this with a brown steering wheel. I don't know if that was wood or what. It would have stood out and looked interesting, but I think the black looks a bit better, so that's what I went with. While I was at it, I painted the gear sticks as well. It seemed to me like doing these in black would look decent. It was a little bit fiddly to get my brush in there and get everything painted, but going slowly and carefully should help. I used the same colour to paint some of the undercarriage and engine-y looking bits. This isn't super important and is most likely not going to be visible, so I don't worry too much about it, and I am planning on adding some rusty colours to it later. To add some interest to the canvas rolls, I got out the AK Interactive Red Brown Leather again, and painted the straps on the rolls. These are raised up a bit from the actual canvas part, which makes it a lot easier to paint the straps neatly. It looks decent enough, but I think some washes will make it look better. So, now it's time for a wash. This ended up making it look dirtier. I thought it was a wash! Ha ha ha! Not even sorry. I guess there could be some argument that this is actually a filter and not a wash, because I'm using it to alter the colour of a slightly larger area, though it is a small area, rather than just to darken down some of the gaps or details. Either way, I'm using Army Painter Strong Tone here, diluted about 50-50 with water, and just kind of painting it onto the seats and canvas rolls. Of course, being careful to avoid the green areas, though this could be spread out and just made to look like a stain or something if it does get onto the green areas. I also applied this to the inside floor of the vehicle, with the intent to make it look a bit more dirty and give it some depth. I didn't film it because I'm really good at what I do, clearly. Moving right along, it's a really good time to paint some wheels, namely the ones on this model, well, the tyres at least. The rims are already painted. For this, I'm using the AK Interactive rubber tyres, because I like the way that it looks like rubber tyres. I did my best to paint only the rubber areas and avoid the rims, and I did okay. The trick is to go slowly and carefully. This may be a Russian vehicle, but we're not Russian. It is okay to make mistakes, of course, we all do it, and they can be fixed later. Also, be sure to paint the spare wheel. It also has rubber, and you'll look like a right ding-dong if you leave it unpainted. Painting the tyres is obviously pretty simple. This paint is fairly thin, which is nice, but that does mean you'll have to do at least 2 coats to get a good coverage. While I'm down here, I figured I might as well use model colour Mahogany Brown to paint the muffler and exhaust pipe. There's not really a lot to that either. Like all the other colours that aren't green, we're mostly just trying to avoid getting this on areas we would like to keep green. That way we can avoid having to make corrections. Speaking of corrections, I fixed the couple of spots of tyre colour I got on the wheel rim by making a mix of roughly 50-50 Russian green and model colour buff, and applying it carefully along the edge of the wheel rim. This should not only take care of the unwanted bits of grey, but also add a highlight around the rim and make it stand out just a little bit more. Of course, the spare wheel gets the same treatment, as well as some other spots around the vehicle, just little areas where I think it's going to add interest. Going slowly and carefully here is a good idea, though I did still manage to mess it up a bit. I fixed that by reapplying some rubber tyres. Obviously you don't want to do this too many times, so I was extra careful. Next I apply some Army Painter Strong Tone to the exhaust pipe and muffler. This is straight out of the bottle, and applied only to the exhaust pipe and muffler. I thinned that down to roughly 50-50 with water, and applied it to the wheels. I figured this might just create a little bit of depth here, particularly in the gaps of the tread. As before, I try not to forget the spare wheel. Then, because I didn't really want the seats to be that filthy looking, I dry brush over them relatively lightly with the base colour, that being AK Interactive Red Brown Leather. I don't want to completely obscure the dirty look created by the strong tone, I just want to bring out the base coat a little bit more. Obviously I'm trying to avoid getting this on the surrounding areas. I do the same thing to the canvas rolls, though using the canvas tone I based them with. I don't think it would have looked very good if I'd used the red brown leather for this. Because I thought it might add some interest, I continued using this colour and dry brushed along the tops of the seats. I feel like this has worked well to make the edges of those seats stand out a bit more, without being too extreme. Then I took some Vallejo Model Air steel and paint the insides of the headlamps. This is fairly simple. I didn't feel a need to do anything too elaborate here. Once that paint had dried, I glued the lenses in, and they did kind of fog up a bit. And I made a bit of a mess with the one on the right side, but it could be worse. After that was all set, I applied a coat of Army Painter Light Tone. This was mixed roughly 3 parts light tone to 1 part water. Maybe a tiny bit more water. I applied this all over the model, including the clear parts. The idea is that this will give an all-over dirty look. It worked well on the Panzer 38Ts I painted a while ago, so I figured it might work here too. This time I put it over the top of everything, to hopefully better convey a dirty look. I considered removing this from the windshield, to try and make it look as though the wipers had been used, but since the windshield is folded down, I thought I might as well leave it dirty so that it looks like it's been driven with that down, and so the driver felt no need to use the wipers. I felt like the acrylics were done at this point, so I sealed it all in with a coat of gloss varnish. You probably won't be surprised to learn that I then applied enamels. I start with AK Interactive Track Wash. This vehicle doesn't have tracks, but this colour will work nicely to weather the undercarriage, which is where I applied it. Pretty much to all of the areas I painted black earlier. I want those areas to look sort of rusty, but not extremely so. I also applied this to the exhaust. I'm trying not to go too heavily with it, and I'm thinning it out on the model as I go. It's very easy to apply and remove this as much as you want to, until you get the desired result. Next, I applied some slightly more rusty accents, because I figured that might add some interest. My AK Interactive Light Rust Wash has thickened up quite a bit, but I'm okay with that. It means I can add spots of it to various points and not have it running everywhere. and that's what I do. Just a few spots here and there, and a fair bit on the towing hitch. I blend it in with clean thinner, and because there's no gloss varnish between this and the previous layer, they will blend together quite easily. Then, as a final touch, I add a little bit of AK Interactive engine grime. I figured this might look interesting around the wheel hubs. Again, I don't want it to be too heavy, and I'm thinning it out on the model. I also applied this to the towing hitch, which did remove a bit of that rustiness, and I thought I might have to add more, but once it was dry, it actually looked a lot better than I thought it would. So that's how I left it. A coat of AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish, and that's the Tamiya GAZ 67B in 1/48 scale painted. I'm pretty happy with the result, though it has turned out looking a bit dirtier than I was initially going for. That's okay though. I guess painting a model is kind of like a journey, in that you might not end up exactly where you thought you would. I tried a couple of things I wasn't sure would work out well, which I think is also a good thing. Sure, they're not super cutting edge experiments or anything like that, and if I was so inclined to look, somebody has probably written something about all of the things I try. But I do find it fun to try things out myself, and it is my favourite way to learn. The things I tried did work, so I'm happy about that. In the future I will definitely be a bit more careful with things like headlight lenses. They haven't turned out completely awful, but they could definitely be better. The matte varnish did make the clear parts look a bit more frosty, so I just went over those again with some satin varnish. I could probably actually scrape all of that stuff off the windshield if I wanted, but it looks fine to me. For now anyway. I figured this would be a quick and fun little model to paint while I also work on other stuff in the background. I didn't get it painted quite as quickly as I would have liked, but I seldom do. There's always something that comes up that needs to take priority, but it's done now and I did enjoy the painting process. As I assume I said in the build video, I've left the driver figure out. In fact, I didn't even build him, so I obviously haven't painted him. Some may consider that an incomplete model, but you can do your models however you like. This is how I've done mine. The only problem with having no driver figure is that if for some reason I decide to mount this on a diorama, it can't be one where sick jumps are being performed. And if that's the case, what's the point? I won't be building a diorama anyway, so this is fine. As usual, for those interested, I'll post a list of the colours I've used painting this model in the description below. Feel free to do whatever you want with that information. Unless what you want to do is get all belligerent about my colour choices. In that case, I'll probably just ignore you. Anyway, if you do want to emulate my paint job, I would love to see pictures of your results over on my Discord server, the link to which is in the description. We would also love to see pictures if you haven't emulated my paint job too. We like seeing models. Also, what do you think of this model and the painting I've done to it? Let me know in the comments section below. If you found this video entertaining or helpful in some way, I would really appreciate it if you were to share it with your friends or anybody you think might get something out of it. Sharing my videos in appropriate places would be very helpful for me. Also, don't forget to subscribe, follow, ring the bell, become a patron or YouTube member, and all the other things you do on YouTube and social media. Links to all of my things are in the description below, and as always, I shall return soon. So until then, be excellent to each other, and thanks for watching. Farewell.